Hello, it's Manu here. A small request. With a different type of video than usually, I decided to make a review of a documentary that I watched. I watched quite a lot of movies and documentaries, especially last year. I watched a ton of movies. So I decided to might as well talk about them in a review form and maybe a little bit more of a ramble afterwards. Because I do like to talk about the things that make me think, especially. Not every movie does that and not every documentary does it, but this one that I just watched was very thought-provoking in quite a few different ways. But before that, let me show you some things that I've worked on recently. Here is a painting that I made, or it's actually oil pastels and acrylics. The colors are very unorthodox, but somehow I quite like it. It's nice to just zoom into the center and see everything unfold. It turns into an optical illusion, at least in my eyes. So this is something that I painted in a hexagonal canvas. Here's some technique study that I was doing at the same time as I was watching the documentary. It doesn't look like much, but there is some interesting things happening there. And next up I will try to add a layer of half transparent paint to it by mixing this transparent gesso with acrylic paint, and maybe do a different type of a texture on top of this and see how they interact with each other. And then something completely different. This is a work in progress and it looks very silly, naivistic. I call this one Moon Bellow with double L, kind of like a double meaning, with moon below and the bellowing of the moose. There is actually a very thick layer of paint here in these blobs, as you can maybe see. So there is interesting texture happening here, and I don't know what I will be putting on the moose, but I will probably put also some type of blobs or plots of maybe stars into the sky, and might as well fill the whole painting with this circular motif. Well, we'll see. I like to keep it open-ended because usually it's the ego and the idea that like it knows what it's doing. That's the point where I trip over. So it's better just not to think about anything. I shouldn't even show this because I quite hate it, but here's some also work in progress. I was playing around with some textures, forms, leftover paints, see what I can come up with. A lot of paint has been used in this. Maybe it will be a good painting eventually, but honestly not too hopeful about that one. But you never know. Anyways, here we go. So yesterday, or was it 2 days ago already, I watched a documentary on Netflix called Inside The Manosphere. And it's a documentary by a British filmmaker, a documentarist, Louis Theroux. A lot of people have seen his documentaries over the years because he has made some of the most famous and impactful documentaries that have come from UK. And he's been active all the way from the 90s. I believe he had this series called Weird Weekends that started in 1998 and lasted for a few years. And there he just spent his weekends with random, very interesting people He has also done documentaries about the Westboro Baptist Church, 3 documentaries about them, Scientology, anorexia, different mental illnesses, people going to Thailand and buying brides there, all kind of crazy ideas. There was one about a Nazi family, very Aryan family, and I haven't seen that one, but I've heard that it's pretty crazy, and I think it came out in 2003, so in a way, even though it's 20 years old, it still feels like it's a very modern theme, and kind of like resurfacing also, which is scary and sad. But so is this one that he just made, and it was released maybe a week ago. Inside the Manosphere. What about it? Well, what is it about? That's what I mean. It's about the manosphere, which means the male influencers working in different social media platforms and trying to kind of share their ideas and how to live life, and maybe share some get rich quick schemes in the meanwhile to young impressionable audiences. I am sounding very cynical, but there is also a reason for it, because it has a lot of negative side effects that I want to go through in this little ramble of a review. So all in all, the documentary is great. And why is it good? Well, I just enjoy the way that Louis Theroux is making his documentaries, and because he's a very jovial, very kind guy and very welcoming, and in a way similar to Andrew Callahan of Channel 5 News, because people just like to open up to him, and he's just listening, he's being quiet, and sometimes there is this little judgment in his eye, but most of the time he just ends up being quiet and lets the people kind of like dig their own grave by just keeping talking, trying to defend their own positions. So that's how he works. I've actually seen one review of this documentary where he was being lambasted, but if this is the first time seeing a Louis Theroux documentary, it might be a little bit triggering to see this guy just enjoying his time with these very controversial people and not really sharing his judgment. But that's how he has always acted on these documentaries, and it has had surprisingly big results. For example, with the Jimmy Savile documentary, he helped with kind of exposing his empire of nastiness in the UK back in the day. So in this documentary, Louis Theroux is going through the world and sharing some time with different male influencers who are working in the Red Pill community. He goes to Marbella, Spain to visit HS Tikitoki, a UK-based influencer, and then he goes to Miami to talk with different people like Sneeko, Myron Gaines from Fresh and Fit, and then Justin Wallace, I think was one of the guys' names. And like I said, it's a red pill community. Well, what is a red pill community? Red pill is a term that comes from Matrix movies, where Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, takes a red pill which makes him to see the truth of life. And this is kind of like one of their main ideas, to say that like people in the everyday life, they are going in their own hamster wheels and going to 9-to-5 jobs and stuff. They're basically slaves of the system, and by taking the red pill you will see this and kind of like be able to free yourself from the everlasting limbo of the system that we have created, and just basically saying that like we can empower ourselves to be liberated from it. There's a lot of other things to do with this red pill community, but that's basically the main gist of it. First he went to the Marbella-based HS Tikitoki guy, And like I said, he's from UK, but he was actually running from the UK police because he had an accident with his Lamborghini, and he was also driving without an insurance. So he was basically just running away from police, and that's why he was situated in Marbella. That also tells a little bit about what type of people we were dealing with in the documentary. So money is very big to them, and also the image of being very powerful and in control. They had these ladies, often only fangirls, and they were also, well, they're talking about a lot of material things like money, cars, big house, and how to get rich and as fast as possible. A lot of the guys, like the HS Tiki guy, he had his own YouTube channels and like social media, but also a more secretive Telegram group with 500,000 people in it, as well as he was selling this $50 a month subscription-based thing where he was just helping people to do stock market trading and maybe go into his kind of like inside group. So that's one of the ways that he was gathering money to himself. The Justin guy from Miami, he was an ex-steel magnate, but he just started to kind of like make videos of his own lifestyle and how he was in a one-way monogamous marriage where the lady is monogamous but he is not, and that was one of the more silly parts of the documentary. There are so many fascinating things that you can kind of like see a pattern emerging when you're watching the 1.5 hour documentary about how these people have their own little differences, but somehow they have their shared ideologies. For example, almost all of them tend to blame the Jews of everything. So there is this anti-Semitic conspiracy about this, like people being in control, and those people in control tend to be Jewish. There also seems to be a very shared view of how to treat ladies. It's very objectifying and basically thinking about themselves a lot, and to have a control over the ladies in their relationships. But one very fascinating thing that they had in common was somehow of a troubled childhood. Many of the male influencers had zero or very bad father relationships. Like the Justin guy, his father was famous, but he was never around in his life, so there was no father figure. Some of their parents were also aggressive and violent. So it was very disheartening to see, but still profound and enlightening to maybe see that like it's probably this lack of a good father figure or a good mother figure in their life, or the kind of like the mixture of both, that ends up making people this kind of like driven to success in material gains, but not in their kind of like self-reflecting or spiritual way or whatever. And that got me thinking a lot, because, well, for example, in my own case, I have an okay father, but there was some traumatic events with my father, and I feel like I didn't get a really good parental image, or like a father figure, that like how to actually act, one that was very resonating with me back in the day. And what helped me eventually was basically art and piano. I started to play piano when I was very young, and playing piano is very nice. It's an abstract way of kind of like opening up your emotions, and what is a better way to analyze your own very abstract emotions that are hard to verbalize, especially when you're young, than to just like play your heart out and find the emotions through music. Music is a magical thing in that sense. Then I started to do videos and eventually painting and all kinds of stuff. But I feel like this is one way of channeling this anxiousness inside of you and the kind of like lack of a figure and lack of a path. Then there is this other way to go, which is to follow the money, say no to all of this this feminine stuff, so to say, and just focus on the material gaining. You can start to be very driven to work out, make your body good, work a lot, and start to gain money and maybe find your self-value from that. There was a very interesting part in the documentary where few of the young people, impressionable young people who saw the Justin Wallace guy outside, they came to say to him that like basically men don't have a intrinsic value when they're born, and that's why they need to work it out. And then on the opposite side they're saying that women have an intrinsic value through their beauty and how they're kind of like getting everything because they're beautiful when they're 20 or whatever. And that was a very gloomy way to look at life, that like women are objectified and at the same time men are given no value. But that has a lot of truth in it, in a sense that like when you have a parent who's saying to you that like you don't matter, your opinions don't matter, and you will never surmount to anything, that will make your self-worth kind of go to zero, and you either want to prove yourself and prove your father that like, okay, I actually am worth of something and that's why I need to work out, that's why I need to do a lot of work and things like that. And that tends to happen quite a lot, and it's a saddening thing to see that like people can act like this even if they're parents and say very bad things to their children. Like my father was most of the time pretty okay, but like even the few places where he was saying these similar mean things to me, they really kind of like stuck with me, that like, okay, maybe I don't have any self-worth. I can see that like if that happens continually in your childhood, it will definitely shape up how you become as a kind of like a young growing person looking for your own identity and sense of purpose in this life. So that's a very striking moment in the documentary, at least to me. And then another thing about how, for example, Sneeko and Myron Gaines, they clearly have their own aesthetic and creative upbringing. They have been aspiring filmmakers, especially Sneeko. When he was a young kid, he was doing YouTube videos with artistic merit in them. But then another thing happens and they are ending up in this red pill circle, and they start to kind of like take the creativity out and just focus on this different type of a world. And I started to notice this dichotomy emerging in the documentary, that like maybe this is the crossing paths moment, the watershed moment in a young male life, that when you're starting to find your worth and finding out like what you are actually like, there are two options. One is to go inside and start the self-reflection part, and that is tough. You need to be able to face and be okay with a certain amount of shame, certain amount of embarrassment, and also a lot of grief and fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of losing your wife, for example, then the embarrassment of your own psychosexual self and embarrassment of your own some failures that you have had in your life, for example, or that like maybe you're not as good as you think you are in some regards in life. And the fear of abandonment, that must be a big thing. A side note, I'm just an armchair psychologist here, so no degrees, but just a lot of thoughts, and you may think to yourself that like maybe they ring truth to you, or maybe I'm just pulling stuff from my hat, which usually tends to happen. But yeah, this is the other way, to be able to go to the road of self-reflection, and it's hard, you need to go through these nasty emotions, but the reward of that is a more long-term enjoyment and contentness in life. And then on the other hand, there is the different path where you're putting your head in the sand, facing the other way, saying no to these annoying emotions, and start to kind of like find your value and meaning from material things, whether that is the ladies, or that is the work, or that is the cars, or Rolex, or these different things. And we know how that story goes. There are multiple stories of how this is a very archetypal way for people to live. And no matter if you're a woman or a man, we all end up in this rabbit hole of finding meaning from things that only give it for a certain amount. And then the next day comes and you end up seeing that the hunger is everlasting, that you are all only able to kind of like be okay with these material things for a little while until you start to desire more things, because that doesn't give kind of like this long-lasting enjoyment in life, especially if the groundwork is not good. You can visualize it, for example, by just like this ground where you're building your own self and persona, being the well, basically how good you're doing this self-reflection and understanding yourself, that means how firm the ground is. And if you're not doing any of that, then you will be basically building your apartment in a muddy soil area or rotten blight town where it all ends up dilapidated in the end. Whereas if you do it on a sturdy ground, then you may be able to create a bigger empire to yourself and find more fulfillment out of that. And this is basically this dichotomy of two paths that I started to think about watching this documentary. One interesting moment in the doc was also with the HS Tiki-Taki guy. In the end, how his mother was also there, and they were basically trying to do this gotcha moment with Louis Theroux on their own Kick live stream, and how his mother acted and reacted was very interesting, because it was clear that like the mother knew better, at least, than HS Tiki-Taki, and I would argue that he also understood better. It wasn't all pathological, but he ends up going on these very provocative side roads with his dialogue tree. But anyway, the mother knew better, but still ended up defending the boy quite often, more often than I was comfortable with. And I got this feeling that it has to do with kind of like the preservation of the ego, in the sense that like it's too much of an embarrassment if he embarrasses the woman and if she embarrasses the son. And these are the tripping points in our lives when we start to kind of like build our egos and our identity, and if we are not able to have any kind of like limelight in the shame and embarrassment, then we will be just pushing that away. And that's one of the reasons probably why we end up being the way we are, because we're just preserving the identity, and if a small wind of doubt comes, it would crumble our house of cards down. And this is the trouble with some people when their identity is not able to last or withstand these questioning moments. Because let's face it, all of our identities are illusory in a sense that like we are creating it and reacting to different things in life, and it's basically that we're just this sponge that takes things. Maybe the sponges are different in that sense that like we filter out things that are interesting to us, but there is very much that's just attached to it just to cope with different ways, coping mechanisms, so to say. And if we are not able to withstand any type of questioning, it means that maybe the groundwork of our ego and identity is not in the best way that they could be. Some smaller notions of the documentary. I'm sorry for being a bit disorganized, because there's quite a few things that I wanted to talk about, and maybe I started to talk about them, but I went to a different route with my train of thought. But I mentioned Myron Gaines and Sneeko having a little bit of this creative background that you can see, and you can see it also in their behavior, that there is this, maybe they're talking the talk but not walking the walk in all places. You can see it when Myron Gaines's ex-girlfriend comes to the picture and he turns into this fluffy guy holding a dog and being a very kind of like warmer at least. And it had a clash with this, or conflict with this very superficial and aggressive, violent things that he was talking about by himself, and how he's planning to have many wives, but when the wife comes there, then the situation becomes more awkward. So it wasn't like that the male influencer framework that he was working with, it didn't feel natural, it felt like a character, and it wasn't pathological. And the same with Sneeko, he has had different paths in his life, and I actually knew of both of these influencers beforehand because I have watched streamers like Destiny and podcasts like H3 that have talked about them and have actually talked with them before, so I knew of their characters and I knew of their history, and I can appreciate a little bit about them. But it's clear that like they had some sort of a redemption inside of them, or ability to be redempted. But then there were few people in the documentary who felt a bit more scary, in a sense that this persona that they have created feels more pathological, that they are actually believing in this, and that like there is no way that you can change their mind from it. And that is a sad thing that can happen in life, and I don't know the kind of working mechanisms behind this, but like maybe it's the same as with narcissism, that it just becomes this very crucial coping mechanism in you, and maybe it is rooted in very early childhood things, that it's just very hard to change from that, because like of this thing of the house of cards that I was mentioning before, that like your ego just doesn't want to be shattered, because it's a very traumatic experience in itself, and you're just more glad to live in this lie that you have created around you. And one other thing that I wanted to mention was that it was very sad to see how big these people actually are and how big of an impact they have. Like whenever they went outside, there were a group of young 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old guys who just looked up to these people, saying things like, "You're like a god to us and we hold you up to a higher standard." And it's crazy and very like makes you feel awake that like, okay, this actually has an effect, and there are some crazy things that it could have an effect on, like Sneeko saying that Baron Trump watches him. So it goes all the way up to the White House in some sense. So it's a real issue, and it probably all stems in childhood and how we are brought up. And it's not just the male issue. There's different flavors with women, and it's not just the father issue. Maybe sometimes the mothers are in a way kind of like at fault as well, because they don't know to push any good limits in their own behavior and how to react with their husband or their kids. But it would break my heart to say that like women would be at fault here, because it's clear that men have an issue at whole. There is a lot of things that men are not willing to talk about when it comes to emotions and being fragile and being able to withstand these hits to your ego. And this could be the root of the issue in a lot of these systemic things that we are facing, and what Louis Theroux is bringing to light with his documentaries. So anyways, that's about it. I would highly suggest you to watch the documentary if you are interested in the subject. It's in Netflix, probably worldwide. And see you in the next video. Tell me if you like this type of a deep dive ramble review, and I could maybe do some more. For example, I've been watching a lot of horror films. There aren't many horror films that I haven't seen, and I do like to... I always make a list of the movies that I've seen and try to see like which ones were actually worth to watch. So if you'd like to hear about my opinions on films and what to see, I also watch other things than horror. I'm a mixed eater, not just a carnivore when it comes to my film taste. See you in the next video, and thanks for watching. Bye bye.